Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a small French town where a boy is sketching faster than his shadow. He's about 12, his pencil always racing ahead of his thoughts. And honestly, if impatience could be an art form, Marcel Duchamp would have invented it right there at the dinner table. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me which city you're in and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marcel Duchamp grows up in Blainville-Crevon, a sleepy village in Normandy that smells like wet earth and paint. His father, a notary, is practical to the bone, but his mother loves music and poetry. In this household, imagination is both tolerated and quietly encouraged, as long as it doesn't interfere with dinner. Marcel is the third of 6 children, and almost all of them end up doing something artistic, which sounds charming until you realize how competitive that makes family gatherings. The Duchamp house is noisy, full of sketches, arguments, and laughter. His older brothers, Jacques Villon and Raymond Duchamp Villon, are already dabbling in modern art, while little Marcel trails behind, absorbing everything like a sponge that hasn't learned when to stop soaking. He spends hours copying comic illustrations and practicing calligraphy. According to one story, he once filled an entire wall with doodles and nearly got grounded for creative vandalism. And as a teenager, Marcel heads to Rouen for school. He's clever, but inconsistent, the kind of student teachers describe as capable. If only he cared. What he really cares about is billiards, jokes, and the smell of turpentine. In his notebooks, you can already see hints of rebellion, little word plays, strange mechanical sketches, and a fascination with how things move. He's not trying to draw beauty. He's trying to catch motion, thought, time itself. In 1904, he finally leaves for Paris, the art capital of the world. For most young painters, this would be a dream come true, a chance to study the masters, mingle with bohemians, and maybe starve in a more glamorous neighborhood. But for Duchamp, Paris is something else, a playground, a chessboard, a laboratory of absurdity. He enrolls briefly at the Académie Julian, though enrolls might be too strong a word for someone who spends most of his time joking with friends and skipping life-drawing classes. The teachers, steeped in academic tradition, preach anatomy and precision. Duchamp, meanwhile, sketches models as geometric abstractions and writes puns in the margins. It's clear he's not destined to be another Delacroix. There's a famous story about how one of his professors told him, "You'll never be a serious painter." Marcel just shrugged and said, "Good." It's the kind of response that's half genius, half teenage defiance, but it hints at something deeper. Even then, Duchamp suspects that seriousness might be the enemy of creativity. Paris in the early 1900s is a storm of styles, post-impressionism still buzzing, Fauvism burning bright with color, Cubism just beginning to form. In cafes, artists debate like philosophers. In Montmartre, they paint like maniacs. And in the middle of it all, Duchamp drifts between circles, observing more than he participates. He visits the studios of his brothers, where discussions about Cézanne and Pissarro stretch long into the night. Yet Marcel feels a quiet restlessness, a sense that painting, despite its power, is somehow too limited for what he wants to express. He begins experimenting with a sense of motion in his works. His early paintings already show figures caught mid-step, colors fractured into energy lines. It's the start of something new, though, even he doesn't yet know what. At this point, art for Duchamp isn't about making something beautiful or even correct. It's about capturing an idea, a flicker, a thought before it disappears. But this curiosity also isolates him. Other students find him odd, too intellectual for the painters, too whimsical for the philosophers. even in a city that celebrates eccentricity. Duchamp seems like an outsider who refuses to choose sides. He's a boy straddling two worlds, the visual and the conceptual, the practical and the poetic. At home, his family worries. His brothers are gaining reputations in Parisian art circles, but Marcel's work doesn't sell, and his letters hint at both ambition and confusion. He writes about the struggle to balance emotion and reason in art, confessing that he feels caught between the canvas and the idea. That phrase will one day define his entire career. By 1909, he starts to show in small exhibitions. Nothing earth-shattering, but his pieces get noticed for their wit. Critics can't quite decide if he's being clever or lazy, which, in a way, is exactly what Duchamp wants. He doesn't want to impress, he wants to provoke thought. And here's a curious fact. Around this time, Duchamp begins to think about time itself not in a scientific sense, but in how art freezes or fails to freeze it. He starts sketching machines that measure motion, diagrams that look half like clocks and half like jokes. Historians still debate whether these early doodles influenced his later Nude descending a staircase or whether he was simply playing around. Either way, that mechanical curiosity will become a signature. There's also his fascination with games, especially chess, which he learns from his brothers. The chessboard, with its rules, logic, and potential for infinite variation, fascinates him more than any art lecture. Later in life, Duchamp will famously say, "I am still a victim of chess. It has all the beauty of art and much more." But here, as a teenager, that obsession is just beginning. By the end of this chapter of his life, Marcel Duchamp has everything and nothing figured out. He's got a sharp mind, a wicked sense of humor, and a feeling that the future of art lies not in color or form, but in ideas. Yet he's still painting, still experimenting, still searching for the spark that will make everything click. The Paris art world, for now, hasn't noticed him. But that's about to change because soon, a single painting will catapult him from obscure dreamer to scandalous legend. Paris in 1910 is a living experiment in chaos. The air smells of oil paint, absinthe, and ambition. Artists crowd the cafes of Montparnasse and Montmartre, swapping gossip and philosophies like poker chips. Every night, conversations spiral into theories about the future of painting, how color should look, how perspective should die, how reality might be rearranged. And somewhere in this storm sits Marcel Duchamp, quietly absorbing it all, cigarette in hand, half amused, half detached. At this point, Duchamp is in his early 20s, awkwardly thin, with a calm gaze that never gives away what he's thinking. He's working as a freelance illustrator for satirical magazines, the kind that poke fun at politics and bourgeois manners. It's steady money, though he finds the work mechanical. Yet even in those comic sketches, there's something unusual. His lines flow with rhythm, like he's trying to animate stillness itself. When he paints in his own time, things get stranger. His early canvases show hints of Cézanne's structure and the fractured geometry of Picasso and Braque. But while those two are reinventing vision through Cubism, Duchamp is already looking for something beyond it. He admires the intellectual rigor of Cubism, the way it breaks objects into planes, how it replaces emotion with structure, but he feels there's still something missing. They're dissecting, he says once to a friend, but not yet questioning. Around 1911, Duchamp joins the Section d'Or, a group of avant-garde painters fascinated by mathematical harmony in art. His brothers Jacques Villon and Raymond Duchamp Villon are already key members, and they bring Marcel into the fold. Meetings take place in cramped studios filled with the smell of turpentine and cheap tobacco. The group debates the fourth dimension, a hot topic then a mix of science, philosophy, and pure imagination. What if painting could express time, not just space? What if a figure could exist in multiple moments at once? These questions electrify Duchamp. He starts sketching figures that twist, overlap, and repeat like frames of motion. His notebooks fill with notes on physics, diagrams, and absurd jokes written in perfect cursive. One page reads, "Can one make works which are not works of art?" A question that will haunt and define him for the rest of his life. In 1912, the search for motion leads to his most infamous experiment, Nude descending a staircase. No. 2. The title sounds innocent enough, almost classical, but what's on the canvas is anything but. The figure isn't really a person at all. It's a sequence of fractured planes and rhythmic echoes, like an X-ray of movement. Imagine Futurism's speed, Cubism's geometry, and Duchamp's dry humor all thrown into a blender. When he submits the painting to the Salon des Indépendants in Paris, chaos erupts. The hanging committee, which includes some of his friends, is baffled. They call the piece too literary, meaning too dependent on ideas rather than pure visual form, a deep insult in that world. One critic supposedly joked, "It looks like an explosion in a shingle factory." Even Picasso, though intrigued, doesn't quite know what to make of it. To Duchamp, their confusion proves his point. Art that merely pleases the eye is too safe. Humiliated but not defeated, he withdraws the painting and quietly decides he's done with Paris, at least for now. He senses that the real revolution won't happen in a studio full of French traditionalists pretending to be radicals. So, later that year, he travels more, spending time in Munich, a city then brimming with intellectual energy. The change of air helps. He visits science museums, studies mechanical drawings, and fills his sketchbooks with notes on motion, machinery, and irony. There, Duchamp's fascination with mechanics crystallizes. He paints the passage from Virgin to Bride and the Bride, strange dreamlike compositions where figures transform into contraptions of tubes, pistons, and wires. They're neither human nor machine, something in between. Historians still debate whether these works reflect sexual tension, technological anxiety, or both. Duchamp, of course, never explains. "I prefer to leave the viewer guessing," he says years later. Explanation kills the mystery. Returning to Paris, he finds himself more alienated than ever. The Cubists, once rebellious, are now forming their own orthodoxy. They have rules, manifestos, hierarchies. Duchamp hates it. For him, art should be freedom, not a doctrine. He begins to see that his future lies not in joining movements but in slipping between them. Here's a lesser-known detail. Around this time, Duchamp takes a job as a librarian at the Sainte Geneviève Library. To most people, that sounds boring. But to him, it's heaven. Endless hours surrounded by books on mathematics, philosophy, and mechanics. He reads about non-Euclidean geometry, the fourth dimension, even early theories of relativity. These ideas start merging with his art. If reality is relative, why shouldn't art be? At night, he meets with friends like Francis Picabia and Guillaume Apollinaire, two men as restless and ironic as he is. Their conversations blend art, science, and nonsense. Duchamp starts making word games, visual puns, and sketches that parody painting itself. One doodle shows a man painting a square while blindfolded, with the caption, "Painting from memory." It's funny and philosophical all at once. By now, he's quietly developing his theory of what he later calls retinal art, art that appeals only to the eye. To him, most painters, even the Cubists, are still obsessed with visual pleasure. He wants something deeper, an art of the mind. "I want to put painting at the service of thought," he writes in a note. That's not arrogance, it's frustration. The eye is too shallow. He's after the brain. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but you can almost feel it solidifying as 1912 becomes 1912. 913. While others are busy chasing color harmonies, Duchamp's sketchbooks are filled with notes like painting of invisible dimensions, aesthetic of indifference, and art as choice. One entry reads simply, "The artist is not the maker but the chooser." That line, written in pencil over a century ago, quietly predicts the ready-made. Still, Duchamp isn't ready to abandon painting yet. He exhibits Nude descending a staircase again, this time not in Paris, but in New York, at the 1913 Armory Show. He doesn't attend in person, but his painting steals the show anyway. American audiences, unprepared for such abstraction, react with a mix of horror and fascination. Newspapers call it the explosion of a woman. People line up to laugh at it, but then something unexpected happens. It becomes famous. Duchamp, the outcast of Paris, becomes the sensation of New York. In letters to friends, he's amused rather than proud. "They finally understand me," he writes ironically, "by not understanding me at all." That's classic Duchamp, a man who turns misunderstanding into art. Meanwhile, his circle of influence grows. Younger artists start to see him not as a rebel but as a visionary. They sense that his irony hides a serious point, that the boundary between art and non-art is thinner than anyone dares admit. Academic scholars later call this the birth of conceptualism, though Duchamp himself insists he was just playing with ideas. There's a curious historical debate about whether his experiments were purely intellectual or secretly emotional. Some argue that beneath the jokes and irony, Duchamp hid deep melancholy. His shift away from painting, they suggest, was less about rejection and more about self-protection. An artist who'd rather destroy the rules than be trapped by them. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. By 1913, Duchamp stands on the edge of something radical. He's about to abandon the brush altogether and redefine what art even means. Paris, for all its brilliance, feels small. New York is calling. And somewhere in his mind, a question hums like a quiet motor. What if art didn't need to be made at all? The year is 1913, and in a cavernous armory on Lexington Avenue in New York, a revolution is hanging on the walls. People crowd around paintings with faces like cubed puzzles and bodies twisted into impossible geometry. The Armory Show has just opened, and America, comfortable in its realism and polite landscapes, is about to get a migraine. Among the hundreds of works from Europe, one painting draws the loudest laughter, the most confusion, and ultimately the deepest fascination: Nude descending a staircase. No. 2. At first, the crowd thinks it's a prank. "Where's the nude?" one man shouts. A woman covers her eyes, pretending to blush, while her husband leans closer, whispering, "I think it's a man. Or maybe a machine." Newspapers call it an explosion in a paint factory. Reporters have a field day describing it as a pile of lumber in motion. Duchamp's name spreads like wildfire, not because people understand his painting, but because they can't stop arguing about it. Duchamp himself isn't even there to witness it. He's in France, quietly amused by the chaos overseas. When letters arrive describing the uproar, he smiles that sly half-smile of his. For the first time in his life, he feels validated by misunderstanding. To him, confusion means people are thinking. The success or scandal, depending on who you ask, changes everything. The Americans see Duchamp as a kind of exotic genius, a representative of radical Europe. The French, meanwhile, start to see him differently too. Not just another Cubist, but something stranger, slipperier, more dangerous. He has broken away from their system entirely. After the Armory Show, Duchamp begins to question not just painting, but the entire premise of art making. What if the act of choosing, of selecting an object or an idea, could itself be creative? He's haunted by that thought. Around this time, he starts tinkering with a bicycle wheel, attaching it to a wooden stool in his studio just to amuse himself. He doesn't call it art, it's simply something to look at and spin. That spinning wheel, though, becomes the embryo of a revolution. It's the first ready-made. But we're not quite there yet. Before the urinal and the bottle rack and all the legendary provocations, Duchamp goes through a quieter, more introspective period. He moves to Rouen for a short while, then drifts between friends' studios in Paris. The art scene has started to exhaust him, all those manifestos, rivalries, and declarations about purity and progress. Duchamp begins to cultivate what he calls aesthetic indifference. To him, detachment is power. When you stop caring whether something is beautiful, you start to see it differently. Here's a little-known detail. In 1913, Duchamp attends a performance of motion studies using stroboscopic lights, early experiments in visualizing movement. The mechanical rhythm fascinates him. Later, he'll describe it as the poetry of motion without emotion. He begins to imagine art not as expression, but as mechanism. His drawings from this period look like blueprints of impossible machines, half erotic, half scientific. Meanwhile, Europe is sliding toward war. In cafes, artists debate aesthetics while headlines scream about armies mobilizing. Duchamp, always the observer, feels a chill in the air. Art has become too serious, he writes to a friend, and the world has become too absurd. The irony isn't lost on him. In early 1915, the absurd becomes real. War breaks out, and France changes overnight. Duchamp, medically unfit for combat, finds himself stuck in limbo, neither soldier nor civilian, neither artist nor worker. His brothers enlist. He feels guilty, restless, and increasingly disillusioned. Art, under these conditions, feels trivial. What good is color when the world is burning? That's when he makes his escape. With the help of friends, he secures passage to America. The journey across the Atlantic is long and tense, but to Duchamp it feels like a rebirth. When he steps off the ship in New York, the city is booming, skyscrapers rising like promises, electricity buzzing through every street. Here, he's anonymous again, free from the European art hierarchy. The American art world welcomes him like a celebrity. Reporters recognize his name from the Armory Show. Collectors are curious about this soft-spoken Frenchman who caused such a stir without even showing up. But Duchamp doesn't play the role of the flamboyant genius. He speaks quietly, smiles politely, and lets his silences do most of the talking. His detachment intrigues people. He rents a small apartment on 14th Street, sparsely furnished with a bed, a chair, and a few odd objects, what he jokingly calls the museum of unnecessary things. Friends drop by expecting to find an artist at work, but there's no easel, no paints. Instead, they find Duchamp tinkering with gadgets, cutting out words from newspapers, or rearranging common objects on shelves. To him, the city itself feels like a living collage: factories, elevators, steamships, typewriters, all these modern machines humming in rhythm. New York liberates him. It's fast, irreverent, full of contradictions, just like his mind. He befriends artists like Francis Picabia, Man Ray, and Catherine Dreyer, who will later help found the Société Anonyme, one of the first modern art organizations in America. They drink, laugh, and brainstorm wild ideas. Out of these late-night conversations emerges a new kind of art, anti-art, they call it. The kind that refuses to please or conform. There's a funny anecdote from this time. One evening, Duchamp walks into a hardware store, buys a standard snow shovel, takes it home, and hangs it from the ceiling. When a friend asks why, he replies, "In advance of the broken arm." That becomes the title. No paint, no carving, no skill, just pure intention. It's absurd, brilliant, and completely unprecedented. When asked what it means, Duchamp simply says, "It means nothing." Critics later argue it means everything. This is the paradox of Duchamp. His refusal to define is itself a definition. But the ready-made isn't just a joke, it's a philosophy. It proposes that art isn't about creating, but about choosing, that the artist's real act is to designate meaning where there was none. It's a radical democratization of creativity, and it infuriates traditionalists. A urinal is not art, they cry, and Duchamp smiles. Exactly, until I say it is. And yes, the urinal, the infamous fountain, arrives in 1917. Duchamp submits it anonymously to the Society of Independent Artists exhibition under the pseudonym R. Mutt. The rules state that any artist who pays the fee can exhibit, so technically, they must accept it. But when the organizers see the porcelain urinal laid on its back and signed like a painting, they panic. They hide it behind a partition. The rejection proves his point perfectly. The piece isn't about beauty or craft, it's about the institution of art itself. Who gets to decide what counts as art? Is it the artist, the viewer, or the gatekeeper? Those questions echo through the entire 20th century, shaping everything from conceptual installations to modern design. Interestingly, scholars still debate whether Fountain was entirely Duchamp's idea. Some claim the real author was his friend, the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, a Dada poet known for her wild performances. The evidence is murky, and historians still argue about it. But whether or not he conceived it alone, Duchamp was the one who turned it into myth. The urinal controversy cements his reputation. To some, he's the destroyer of art. To others, its savior. He's invited to exhibitions, salons, and dinners, though he remains the same aloof, dry-witted man. When asked if he ever misses painting, he says, "No, I prefer breathing." By now, he's living in New York almost full-time, splitting his days between artistic experiments and his growing obsession with chess. To friends, it looks like retreat. To him, it's just evolution. The chessboard becomes a metaphor for everything he believes in: strategy, chance, and the beauty of logical play. Still, the aftershocks of Nude, Descending a Staircase, continue to ripple through the art world. Critics revisit it, calling it prophetic, mechanical poetry, the first painting of time. What was once mockery becomes admiration. Duchamp, the man who refused to take painting seriously, accidentally changes painting forever. And yet, he doesn't look back. He's already dismantling the future, one joke, one object, one quiet act of rebellion at a time. The boy who once drew too fast has stopped drawing altogether, but somehow the world is finally catching up to his speed. He stops trying to make pretty pictures, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a manifesto pinned to a gallery door, but with a series of small, stubborn refusals. Refusing applause, refusing to varnish, refusing to pretend the canvas is the only place ideas can live. Marcel Duchamp moves from brushes to brains, not because he hates beauty, he never hated beauty, but because he decides beauty is too easy a disguise for thinking. In the quiet of studios and the hum of cafes, he begins to treat art more like a riddle than a reward. The shift looks almost accidental from the outside, like a person turning a corner and finding a new landscape. Up close, it's deliberate and careful. Duchamp's notebooks from this period teem with diagrams, maps, and marginalia, arrows that point to nothing, phrases that read like private jokes, a page here annotated "aesthetic of indifference." He calls attention to indifference as if it were a tool, a way to neutralize the sentimental reflex that makes viewers fall in love with color instead of idea. Where other painters chase optical delight, he practices what he later dubs retinal skepticism, an almost clinical refusal to let the eye dictate the terms of art. This is the era of the large glass. He begins with glass not because glass is pretty, but because glass is paradoxical, transparent yet separating, fragile yet architectural. The work's full title, "The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors," even sounds like a joke and a catastrophe rolled into one, and Duchamp intends it that way. He treats the canvas, the glass, not as a surface for technique, but as a page for thought experiments. The bride becomes a mechanical erotica, an allegory rendered in metallic diagrams, chocolate grinders, and phantom machinery. Its two panels suggest courtship and failure, machines and desire, and the whole thing accumulates dust and cracks as if the world is allowed to age it while he sleeps. During these years, the studio looks less like an atelier and more like an inventor's shed. Sketches taped to walls, toy parts, schematic scribbles, odd fragments of language. The large glass takes years, it takes patience and neglect, because Duchamp treats creation and deterioration as co-authors. He lets accidents happen, lets dust settle, lets a broken wire remain a clue rather than a mistake to erase. It's an early performance of entropy. The artwork is allowed to be messy in time, just like life. One mainstream historical point here is simple but seismic. By refusing to prioritize manual skill, Duchamp inaugurates a new hierarchy where idea outranks craft. That reordering shows up everywhere that follows conceptual art, performance, installation, and historians can draw a straight line from the glass panels in his New York studio to museum floors decades later. The large glass is not merely an object, it's a proposition about what art can be. Not an object to behold, but a problem to be read, puzzled, and argued over. Alongside the large projects, Duchamp keeps inventing mini-provocations. He composes word objects, puns that are also sculptures, ready-made titles that slide like jokes into critical spaces. He writes notes that act like instructions, such as "artists are dealers in ideas." He structures exhibitions where the absence of an object becomes a presence. These gestures seem charmingly evasive, surely the work of a prankster, but they are also profoundly political. Duchamp experiments with the power structures of the art world. The committees, the juries, the polite arbiters who decide which canvases opt into history. He starts to undermine authority by showing that the selection itself is the artistic act. A small, curious fact that rarely makes it into textbooks. While he is working on the large glass, Duchamp becomes obsessed with the minutiae of mechanics to an almost domestic degree. He studies the exact shape of chess pieces to the point of designing custom pawns, and he collects industrial catalogues the way other artists collect color swatches. He writes measurements like a lover writes a name. That attention to the banal washers, cogs, the angle of a bracket feeds his art. The machinery in his compositions looks less like machines in the industrial sense, and more like machines of thinking, clockwork metaphors for desire, failure, and miscommunication. The circle around Duchamp evolves too. He's no longer simply a figure among Cubists or Futurists. The network grows eccentric and international. Poets, scientists, Dadaists, photographers, and theatre people mingling in smoke-filled rooms. Some are committed to nonsense as a tool, a way to expose the seriousness that hides the absurd. Others are serious about exposing seriousness. Duchamp fits both camps. He treats Dada's irreverence as a cousin to his intellectual detachment, a shared allergy to kitsch and to easy catharsis. Yet he also refuses any totalizing label. He never wants a movement that can be summarized in a museum placard. If a label starts to look tidy, he moves on. Then there's the formal invention of the ready-made as concept and category. He's been making derisive gestures for years, declaring a shovel a title, mounting a wheel on a stool for the sheer fun of spinning, but now he sharpens this into theory. The ready-made is a seed. Pick an ordinary manufactured object, place it in a certain context, sign it, and the object becomes a proposition. The creative act is the selection. The work is the concept's ability to stick with people and make them untidy in thought. He isn't merely vandalizing taste. He is pointing out the theatrical nature of valuation. How do you decide the difference between commodity and masterpiece? Duchamp forces institutions and viewers to answer or to show their inability to. As Duchamp leans more on ideas, he also leans more into performance-like identities. He dabbles in alter egos and pseudonyms, names that are puns, jokes, and philosophical stabs. These invented identities keep his presence ambiguous and deliciously ungraspable. They're not mere pranks, they function as experiments in persona. When an artist becomes a character, who is performing the name, the physical person, or the collective expectation? At this point, the chessboard becomes more than a hobby. It's a laboratory. Duchamp plays with chess as if it were a theory of decision-making, moves, counters, strategies, the elegant cruelty of forced choices. Chess teaches him patience, and in age he will claim it steals from his artistic productivity. But that theft is itself generative. Games become models for how ideas propagate and how institutions entrench themselves. He sees the museum like a chess tournament full of strategy, bluff, and long games played in friendly exteriors. There are quieter, odder projects too. A retinal questionnaire, mock exhibitions, the cataloguing of art objects of indifference, and small textual puzzles that look like they belong in a logic seminar rather than an art gallery. He writes an essay that reads more like an instruction manual. Ask whether art needs to please the eye. He listens to mathematicians and physicists with the rapt attention of someone tracking a punchline. The encounter with science pushes him toward an art of propositions that can be falsified, parried, or reinterpreted. He wants his works to survive argument, not varnish. Of course, not everyone appreciates this reorientation. Traditional critics furrow their brows and accuse him of cynicism. Fans of painterly romance call him cold. Yet other artists, especially younger ones, feel liberated. Duchamp's experiments create an opening for practices that do not require mastery of a brush. They permit ideas, gestures, and texts to take center stage. That historical causality is visible. The later rise of conceptual art, installations, and performance owes something to Duchamp's insistence that meaning can be chosen rather than manufactured. One sentence worth placing plainly here. Scholars still debate whether Duchamp's withdrawal from active painting is best read as a deliberate strategy to expand art's territory, or as a defensive retreat from the commercial pressures of success. Some argue that his move is tactical and visionary. Others insist it is personal and avoidant. The tension makes the story richer. He is both tactical and human, a man designing a new grammar for art, while also protecting himself from fame's corrosive heat. In daily life, his humor endures. He writes captions that function as philosophy, and he plays practical jokes that quietly puncture pomp. Yet there are moments of gravity, when he lets the large glass stand unfinished for years, or when he signs a commonplace object and watches the gallerist scramble. The gestures are playful and ruthless at once. He is performing a long, elegant experiment. What happens if art becomes a question rather than a commodity? By the end of this period, painting has become a predecessor rather than a master. The canvas's reign diminishes because Duchamp insists on a broader field space for ideas to roam, for institutions to be examined, for viewers to be implicated. He does not abolish aesthetics, he complicates them. Art, in his hands, becomes less of an object to own and more of a conversation to inherit and continue. And when he finally steps back, taking up chess more often and leaving neat provocations in his wake, the world does not fall silent. Instead, galleries begin to wonder what making truly is. Critics sharpen their pens, and younger artists start treating the art world as a set of problems to be solved, rather than a ladder to climb. Duchamp's brain-first approach has a slow, spreading effect, like a rumor that gradually reshapes how people count value. He hasn't abandoned fascination with form, he has simply convinced the world to notice thought as form. The transition from brushes to brains is not an escape but a redefinition less romantic than that, more precise, and oddly, more intimate. He asks the world to think along with him. Some do. Some refuse. Either way, a new era is quietly assembling itself. One where the idea finally gets to speak. By now, Marcel Duchamp has already fractured the rules of what art can be, but the real shock is that he's just getting started. He has dismantled the frame, shattered the hierarchy, and walked out of the Painters Guild with that quiet, sly grin that says, "You thought I was done? Watch this." The next phase of his life unfolds like a slow, strategic chess match against the entire art world. Every move looks calm on the surface, but underneath it hums with subversion. New York becomes his playground. In the 1,910 seconds and 1,920 seconds, the city hums with a peculiar energy, half skyscraper ambition, half immigrant chaos. Artists, poets, and visionaries tumble into one another's studios, and Duchamp fits right in. He joins the circle of avant-garde expatriates who fled Europe's wars and conventions. The salons are less about wine and gossip and more about trading ideas like rare currency. In dim rooms with flickering gaslight, they talk about machines that dream, poetry that sounds like engines, and whether chance itself can be a medium. Duchamp listens, smiles, and keeps his best ideas close, like a magician palming his final card. He spends nights talking with Francis Picabia, Man Ray, and a cluster of misfits who will later be labeled Dadaists. But at this point, Dada isn't a movement, it's an attitude, an allergy to seriousness. They treat art like a science experiment conducted during a nervous breakdown. And Duchamp, ever the calm one in the room, finds their chaos refreshing. He sees in Dada what he has always quietly believed, that art doesn't have to console or instruct. It can simply exist as resistance to boredom and convention. His contribution to this restless circle is, of course, conceptual. He introduces the idea that context itself is an art form. He reminds everyone that the museum, the gallery, and even the viewer's expectation can be manipulated like pigments. When he enters a group show in 1917 with a urinal flipped on its back, titled Fountain, signed R. Mutt, he doesn't just make a joke, he detonates an idea. Let's linger on that moment, because the fountain isn't a random prank. Duchamp is part of the Society of Independent Artists, which proudly declares that any artist who pays the entry fee can exhibit their work. No jury, no censorship, no gatekeepers. So Duchamp tests that promise. He buys a standard porcelain urinal, lays it on its back, signs it with a pseudonym, and submits it as a sculpture. The committee, horrified, refuses to display it. The irony? Duchamp himself is on that very committee. Historians still debate whether R. Mutt refers to the plumbing company J.L. Mutt Iron Works or to a cartoon strip called Mutt and Jeff. But what matters more is that the act exposes a truth. Even open systems of art are never neutral. Someone still decides what counts. Duchamp forces that decision into the light. When the scandal breaks, the art world reacts with confusion, disgust, and fascination. Critics ask, is this even art? Duchamp, characteristically detached, offers no definitive answer. He claims the artist's choice, the simple act of naming something as art, is enough to create art. It's not about skill or beauty anymore. It's about thought. That single gesture reshapes the century. Without Fountain, there might be no Warhol soup cans, no Yoko Ono performances, no conceptual installations that fill entire rooms with air and meaning. It's a pivot in history that turns the artist into philosopher, the viewer into co-creator. The quiet brilliance of Duchamp's rebellion is that it never feels loud. He doesn't lecture, he demonstrates. He writes no manifestos, only small notes and ironic remarks that sound like riddles. Art is either plagiarism or revolution. The creative act is not performed by the artist alone. Each phrase lands like a stone in a still pond, its ripples widening through decades. At this point, Duchamp starts to play even more deeply with identity. He invents Rose C'est la vie, his female alter ego, complete with photographs taken by Man Ray. The name itself is a bilingual pun, Eros, c'est la vie, meaning Eros, that's life. Under this new name, Duchamp signs artworks, objects, and even love notes. Sometimes he appears in public dressed as a rose, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. It's not drag for performance's sake, it's another test of perception. If an artist can change gender, signature, and context, and the work still functions, then what exactly is the stable self we keep assigning meaning to? Rose C'est la vie becomes a quiet revolution inside the larger revolution. The art world isn't ready to handle it, but Duchamp doesn't care. He's not chasing attention, he's chasing freedom. This is his ultimate paradox. The man who refuses to play the game ends up rewriting the rule book. Meanwhile, the world outside continues to change. The 1,920 seconds roar with jazz, cigarettes, and surrealism. Duchamp watches with faint amusement as new movements bloom around him: surrealism, constructivism, even early abstraction. André Breton begs him to officially join the surrealists, but Duchamp stays uncommitted. "I am not an artist," he says once. "I am a breather." That's not modesty, it's philosophy. He wants to live in a space where ideas breathe before they harden into styles. A small, curious fact: when others chase fame, Duchamp quietly helps friends instead. He assists Catherine Dreyer in creating the Société Anonyme, one of the first modern art museums in America. He curates, organizes, and writes, treating curation itself as another layer of conceptual art. Historians later call this his invisible masterpiece, the way he shapes culture by deciding what others see. By the 1,930 seconds, Duchamp's public output slows almost to nothing. Critics think he's retired, but he's not. He's simply shifted fields again to chess, that perfect metaphor for intellect and delay. He competes in tournaments, writes chess commentary, and even designs a new kind of chess set. The move baffles his admirers, but to him, it's natural. Chess, he says, is much purer than art. In chess, beauty has no meaning except in the fight. And yet he never truly leaves art. He's just learning how to hide his work inside time. He builds secret projects, makes quiet sketches, and plants conceptual seeds no one will find until decades later. Like the perfect chess endgame, he's thinking many moves ahead. One detail that almost sounds like fiction: Duchamp once claimed that after 1923 he abandoned art entirely. But years later, after his death, curators discovered that he had spent 2 decades secretly constructing a final masterpiece behind a wooden door in his studio. But that's a story for another section. For now, in the middle of his life, he stands as both artist and anti-artist, a paradox, walking in a bowler hat. The public doesn't know what to make of him. He's too quiet for a provocateur, too mischievous for a philosopher, too intellectual for a clown. But perhaps that's exactly his intention. He's not trying to be understood. He's trying to make sure no one ever stops thinking. So while other artists chase clarity, Duchamp continues to cultivate confusion, the fertile kind, the kind that makes people see differently. His friends might call him aloof, but he's simply a man who sees art not as an answer, but as a perpetual question. And every time he plays another quiet, cunning move, whether it's signing R, Mutt, becoming a rose, or stepping away entirely, the board changes shape again. By the time the 1,930 seconds slide into the 1,940 seconds, Marcel Duchamp has already achieved something most artists never dare to attempt. He has made disappearance into an art form. While his peers rush to exhibit, to publish, to cement their names in catalogues, Duchamp perfects the opposite skill, strategic invisibility. He moves through the art world like a ghost in a tailored suit, visible only when he chooses to be, never long enough to be pinned down. And yet, from that shadowy position, he exerts influence like a gravitational field. Everyone orbits him, even those who claim not to care. The world is on fire again. War breaks out across Europe, and the avant-garde disperses like startled birds. Many of Duchamp's old friends, Picasso, Breton, Ernst, scatter to the Americas. Duchamp himself manages to leave occupied France in 1942, sailing for New York once again. He's older now, quieter, but there's that same glint of irony in his eyes, the same patient detachment, as though he's still playing an elaborate chess game with history itself. When he arrives, New York has changed. It's no longer the scrappy avant-garde outpost he knew in 1915, it's becoming the world's new art capital. European refugees have filled its cafes and studios. Ideas collide in English, French, German, and the half-languages invented between cigarettes and jazz. Duchamp fits right in, yet he also hovers above it all, like an amused observer who's seen this movie before. He spends time with Peggy Guggenheim, helps curate exhibitions, and befriends a younger generation of artists who regard him with reverent confusion. One of the first things he does is help install the first Papers of Surrealism exhibition in 1942. The show is meant to introduce surrealism to American audiences, but Duchamp, tasked with hanging the show, decides to make it unhangable. He fills the gallery with a chaotic web of string, hundreds of feet of it, crisscrossing the space so that visitors have to crouch, duck, and weave their way through the works. Children play games inside it while critics grumble. It's part prank, part philosophy, an environment where art becomes an obstacle course, not a shrine. Peggy Guggenheim reportedly laughs for days. That's Duchamp's brilliance in wartime exile. He turns every assignment into a commentary. The art world, still trying to find moral clarity amid the ruins of Europe, struggles to understand this man who refuses solemnity. Why joke when everything burns? One critic asks. Duchamp's unspoken answer: because humor is one of the few tools left that still works. It's during this period that he fully adopts his other passion, chess, not as a distraction but as a philosophy. He competes in serious tournaments, writes for chess magazines, and even represents France in the chess Olympiads. His days are filled with the rhythm of boards, moves, and long silences. To outsiders, it looks like he's abandoned art completely. To those who know better, chess is simply his studio under a new disguise. A fascinating, lesser-known detail: Duchamp designs an entire chess set, customized down to the smallest piece. The pawns are sleek, almost abstract, the knights reduced to minimal curves. He also conceives a color contrast chessboard made for television, a design so far ahead of its time that broadcasters only understand its genius years later. When asked why he's so devoted to the game, he says, "It's like art without the audience." But even as he plays chess in cafes, he's still manipulating the art world from a distance. He acts as an informal advisor to collectors, curators, and younger artists. He counsels Peggy Guggenheim on which pieces to buy for her gallery Art of This Century. He helps translate the cryptic philosophies of the Surrealists for confused American journalists. And he occasionally almost mischievously re-releases his old works, this time as limited editions. It's a quiet revolution in itself, the concept of the authorized replica, which blurs the line between original and copy. When Duchamp starts issuing replicas of fountain, bottle rack, and bicycle wheel, critics are baffled. Isn't the ready-made supposed to be unique? But Duchamp shrugs. If the idea is important, the object doesn't matter. He turns reproduction into another layer of meaning. If an artwork can exist as multiples, then originality itself is just another illusion. His influence deepens among younger American artists who are tired of Expressionism's emotional fireworks. Jackson Pollock and his peers are painting storms of gesture and angst. Duchamp, by contrast, stands for precision, irony, and restraint. To some, he looks like the antidote to overblown emotion. To others, he's an ancient trickster who's seen every trend come and go. Either way, everyone's paying attention again. There's a moment small but telling when André Breton tries to recruit him back into the surrealist fold, insisting that Duchamp's work has always been surrealism in disguise. Duchamp politely declines. "I prefer to breathe," he says, echoing his old line. He refuses labels with a consistency that borders on aesthetic discipline. His art might mutate, but his independence never does. In 1946, he quietly begins work on something extraordinary, his secret final masterpiece, the one no one will see until after his death. He rents a small studio on West 14th Street and starts building what looks, from the outside, like a bizarre cabinet. Inside, he constructs an elaborate tableau involving a wooden door, a female form, and a landscape viewed through peepholes. He photographs models, collects fabric, and studies lighting like a stage director. But to the world, he's retired. "I don't make art anymore," he tells interviewers. The truth? He's making the most ambitious work of his life, just invisibly. Meanwhile, the art world continues to revolve around him like a rumor. The younger generation, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, study his writings, trade his quotes, and argue about what he meant. Duchamp's retirement becomes the most productive absence in modern art. His silence functions as theory. There's an odd little story from these years that shows his attitude perfectly. During a dinner in New York, a critic asks him whether he ever feels guilty for abandoning painting. Duchamp pauses, smiles faintly, and says, "No, I feel liberated." Then he adds, "Artists spend too much time painting. They should spend more time thinking." That one line spreads through the art schools like wildfire. Half the professors nod in agreement, the other half grind their teeth. By the 1950 Duchamp has achieved a paradoxical kind of fame. He's a cult figure whose main work is his refusal to work. Museums invite him, universities quote him, and students whisper about him like a myth. He attends exhibitions casually, often as a guest of honor, and yet he seems detached from all the reverence. "It's amusing," he says once, "to watch people take things seriously that began as jokes." His humor, though, is never cruel. It's precise, surgical, almost tender in its skepticism. When he speaks, it's with a tone that combines philosophy and deadpan comedy. "Art is just a game between all people of all periods," he muses in one interview. "The outcome doesn't matter. The moves do." Even the academic world, which once dismissed him, begins to write papers about his ideas. Terms like meta-art, institutional critique, and the dematerialization of the art object start appearing in journals. They don't know it yet, but they're writing the vocabulary of postmodernism, and Duchamp's fingerprints are on every word. Historians, as usual, can't quite agree on how to classify him. Some argue that he's a philosopher masquerading as an artist, others that he's a comedian hiding as a prophet. A few even suggest he's both at once. What they all agree on, however, is that Duchamp's quiet in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds is deceptive. It's the silence of someone laying the groundwork for the next century. And so, as the war ends, Europe rebuilds, and America takes center stage, Duchamp watches the scene with calm amusement. He's not chasing relevance, because relevance is already chasing him. Every movement that follows pop art, conceptualism, minimalism echoes something he once murmured decades earlier in a smoky cafe. He spends his days traveling between New York and Europe, playing chess in parks, meeting friends, and maintaining that playful mystery about whether he's still making art. People ask, he smiles. That's answer enough. Behind that smile, though, there's still that door in his studio, still the secret project taking shape piece by piece. But no one knows that yet. They just see an aging man at a chessboard, serene and deliberate, as if he's waiting for the final move in a game only he understands. The year is 1917. The world is tearing itself apart in war, but Marcel Duchamp is quietly launching a rebellion of a very different kind, a rebellion made not with guns or armies, but with a porcelain urinal. He's in New York now, fully settled into the city's strange rhythm. A place where jazz is just starting to simmer in basement clubs, and artists are beginning to believe that anything, absolutely anything, can be called modern. Duchamp has become part of a tight circle of avant-garde misfits who spend nights in smoky studios arguing about the future of art and days poking fun at the very institutions that try to define it. And this is where Fountain happens. It starts almost as a joke. Duchamp, together with a few friends from the Society of Independent Artists, wants to test the limits of their upcoming exhibition. The rule is simple. Anyone who pays the $6 membership fee can submit a work. No jury, no censorship. Freedom, pure and simple, or so they claim. So Duchamp, ever the trickster, buys a standard urinal from J.L. Mutt Ironworks, turns it on its back, signs it R. Mutt 1917, and submits it under that name. He calls it Fountain. No elaborate frame, no brush strokes, no effort to disguise what it is, just a blunt, white urinal, an industrial product. The reaction? Pandemonium. The board of the society, the very people who swore there would be no censorship, quietly removes Fountain from the exhibition. Too obscene, they say. Too indecent. They worry about public morals. Duchamp resigns in protest. But the story doesn't end there. A photographer friend, Alfred Stieglitz, helps Duchamp take a beautifully lit photograph of Fountain, displayed dramatically against a painting backdrop. The photo gets published in The Blind Man, a small avant-garde magazine that defends the work and insists that Fountain is indeed art precisely because Duchamp chose it. And this is the key. Duchamp didn't make Fountain in the traditional sense, he selected it. His act wasn't about crafting beauty, it was about redefining what art could be. He once said, "It's the artist's choice that transforms an object into art." The idea was revolutionary, and honestly, kind of hilarious at the time. Critics mocked it. One even wrote that Duchamp had pulled the chain on art itself. But among the Dadaists and the few sympathetic souls who saw what he was doing, Fountain became a symbol of freedom, the freedom to question everything, even the sanctity of the museum pedestal. Duchamp calls this kind of work a ready-made term that would echo through art history for decades to come. He begins to collect and title other everyday objects. A bottle rack, a snow shovel, a comb. simple things, each elevated to art by intention alone. Historians still debate his motivation. Some argue he was mocking the art world's obsession with originality. Others think he was genuinely exploring the idea of authorship, asking whether art could exist independently of the artist's hand. And then there's the possibility that he simply found it all funny, that the absurdity itself was the point. No one can say for sure. Duchamp, true to form, never really clarified it. He loved ambiguity the way some people love wine. But here's the irony. Fountain, the piece that scandalized everyone, eventually becomes the most influential artwork of the 20th century. In 2004, nearly a century later, a panel of experts votes it the most important artwork of modern times above Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Matisse's The Red Studio. Let that sink in. The same urinal that got rejected for being vulgar now sits at the top of the modern art hierarchy. Of course, the original fountain is lost, probably thrown out or destroyed. What remains are the replicas Duchamp later authorized, along with the legend. But maybe that's exactly how he wanted it. After all, he never cared about physical permanence. To him, the idea was the art. And that's the paradox that keeps scholars awake at night. If the object is lost but the concept survives, is the art still real? Some say yes, that the ready-made lives in the mind, not in the museum. Others argue that without the object, there's nothing to experience. The debate continues, looping endlessly, like one of Duchamp's chess endgames. Meanwhile, Duchamp himself seems almost amused by the chaos he's unleashed. When people ask him if he's serious about Fountain, he shrugs and smiles. Whether Mutt made it with his own hands or not has no importance, he says. He chose it. He created a new thought for that object. It's both an explanation and a riddle. And with that, Duchamp quietly steps away from painting altogether. He's achieved what he wanted. He's exposed the fragile conventions of art, revealed how much of it depends on belief, context, and the aura of the artist's name. From here on, he won't be chasing fame or recognition. He'll be playing a longer, quieter game, both literally and metaphorically. Because in the next chapter, Marcel Duchamp trades his brushes for a chessboard. And if you think Fountain was provocative, wait until you see what he does with silence. The studio lights fade. The brushes gather dust. And somewhere in a quiet apartment in Paris, a chessboard gleams under a single lamp. Marcel Duchamp, once the enfant terrible of modern art, now spends his days pondering knights, bishops, and pawns. To most of his old friends, it looks like a disappearance. To Duchamp, it feels like liberation. He has walked away from art, or so it seems. But anyone who has followed his story closely knows better. Duchamp never really stops making art. He just changes the board. After the chaos surrounding Fountain and the other ready-mades, Duchamp begins to feel that the art world has started to turn into a circus, a place where galleries and collectors chase novelty, not ideas. "I'm not interested in repeating myself," he once mutters to a friend. Art has become a habit, and habits are dangerous. So, he does the most radical thing an avant-garde artist could possibly do in the 1920 seconds. He disappears from the scene. He moves between Paris and New York, keeping a low profile. Instead of attending exhibitions, he studies chess for hours every day. He joins tournaments, learns openings, studies endgames. The same man who once challenged the definition of art now obsesses over how to trap a king in 8 moves. And he gets good, shockingly good. By the late 1920 seconds, Duchamp is playing in national-level competitions for France. He even represents the country at several chess Olympiads, competing against some of the greatest minds of his generation. To him, The 64 squares of the chessboard hold the same mystery as a blank canvas. The chess pieces, he says, are the blocks with which one constructs beautiful forms. Their power is in their movement. It's hard not to notice how similar that sounds to his old theories of art. But here's the thing, his friends think he's lost it. Picasso writes to him, half concerned, half mocking. Are you sure you're not wasting your time with these wooden toys? Duchamp replies with a smile. My dear Picasso, chess is not wooden, it's mental sculpture. That phrase, mental sculpture, becomes his quiet mantra. For him, chess is pure thought, stripped of decoration and material. No galleries, no collectors, no critics, just the mind. The problem and the possibility of perfection. Still, the art world refuses to let him go. Whenever he attends gatherings, people bombard him with questions. When will you paint again, Marcel? Are you preparing another scandal? He only smiles and answers, I am still painting, but with chess pieces. There's a certain poetry to this period of his life. While the rest of the 20th century avant-garde explodes surrealism, constructivism, abstract expressionism, Duchamp sits quietly in smoky cafes, scribbling chess notations on scraps of paper. He studies under the legendary chess master Savielly Tartakower, analyzes games in La Stratégie magazine, and even writes chess columns for newspapers. He translates a chess manual from Russian into French and debates game theory with mathematicians. At night, he meets with a small group of friends, poets, writers, and exiles who gather not to talk about art, but about strategy and abstraction. One of them recalls, he looked at the chessboard the way a painter studies a horizon, composed, silent, completely absorbed. And yet, behind that quiet exterior, Duchamp is still scheming. In 1927, he marries Lydie Sarrazin Levasseur, a wealthy woman from an industrial family. Their marriage lasts only a few months. Why? Legend says that Duchamp spent their honeymoon playing chess, barely leaving the board long enough to talk. Lydie eventually glues his chess pieces to the table out of frustration. Duchamp, naturally, finds this hilarious. Perhaps, he later says, that was her first ready-made. It's a story that might be apocryphal, but it captures the essence of Duchamp perfectly. Calm, mischievous, and always living half a step outside the ordinary world. As the years pass, his reputation begins to take on a mythic quality. Younger artists start whispering his name like a secret code. They admire his refusal to play by the rules, his decision to walk away from fame just as it was within reach. Salvador Dalí calls him a saint of laziness. Others compare him to a monk, meditating over a board instead of a canvas. But Duchamp himself dislikes the romanticism. I am not lazy, he says. I am simply avoiding repetition. He continues to experiment quietly in the background, designing chess sets, creating optical illusions, and tinkering with strange mechanical contraptions. Some of these would later reappear in his final, mysterious work. But for now, he keeps them hidden. Art historians still debate this period intensely. Did Duchamp truly abandon art? Or was the entire retirement itself a kind of performance piece, a meta-artwork about the very act of not creating? One camp believes he meant it sincerely, that chess gave him the intellectual stimulation he craved without the vanity of art. The other insists that his withdrawal was his greatest artistic gesture of all, a refusal that redefined authorship and creation. And maybe, as always, both sides are right. Because here's the secret. Even in his silence, Duchamp's presence continues to shape everything around him. The Dadaists still invoke his name. The Surrealists study his earlier works. The young conceptualists beginning to stir in post-war Europe cite him as their invisible guide. His decision to do nothing becomes, paradoxically, one of the most influential acts of the century. It's almost like a grand chess endgame, the kind where the best move isn't to attack, but to wait. To hold your position so perfectly that your opponent runs out of options. Duchamp seems to understand this instinctively. He's playing time itself now, waiting for the world to catch up. And as he sits at his board, cigarette smoke curling in the lamplight, he smiles faintly. The pieces move. The night deepens. Somewhere, he mutters to himself, art is a game, and chess is its echo. The clock ticks. He presses the button, ending his turn. The next move, like his next masterpiece, can wait. The 1,950 seconds arrive, and Marcel Duchamp has already achieved a strange kind of immortality. His ideas float through the art world like invisible currents, shaping minds while he keeps himself comfortably out of the spotlight. He's no longer the provocateur of Fountain or the Dadaist prankster in Parisian cafes. He's older, quieter, and increasingly focused on perfecting that delicate balance between presence and absence. Yet paradoxically, the less he produces, the more he influences. He travels frequently between New York and Paris, attending occasional exhibitions, visiting friends, and quietly advising collectors and curators. Duchamp is the sort of person who can sit in a gallery corner and, without uttering a word, shift the way people perceive everything on display. The younger generation, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, study his earlier works obsessively. They dissect his ready-mades, replay his chess games, and argue endlessly over the philosophical implications of Fountain. Duchamp himself watches these discussions with a calm amusement, occasionally offering cryptic comments that feel like riddles. A less-known fact is that during this decade, Duchamp also begins experimenting with optical devices. He's fascinated by perspective, motion, and visual perception. He constructs small mechanical objects that twist images, creating illusions of movement, depth, or impossible angles. These experiments are private, playful, and meticulously detailed. For Duchamp, these devices are another way to challenge the idea of what can constitute art. The public, largely unaware, assumes he is fully retired from creative work. Meanwhile, the art world is entering a post-war frenzy. Abstract expressionism dominates New York galleries. Pollock's gestural splashes, de Kooning's distorted figures, Rothko's color fields all demand attention. Duchamp, however, remains a ghostly presence. He doesn't compete. He doesn't join movements. Instead, he cultivates subtle disruptions. He teaches, advises, and plays games. His chessboard becomes a metaphor for strategy, the invisible hand behind ideas rather than a painter's visible brushstroke. One particularly curious story involves Duchamp's secretive final masterpiece. For years, he rents a small studio on West 14th Street in Manhattan. No one sees him working there, but he is constructing an elaborate project, piece by piece, behind closed doors. The work involves a wooden door, a female figure, and a landscape arranged through peepholes. The entire installation is intended to be interactive. Viewers must manipulate objects, look through carefully placed openings, and assemble meaning themselves. It is a work of conceptual art before the term even exists, and it remains hidden until decades later, preserved only in notes and photographs Duchamp carefully documents. The genius of this hidden project lies in its philosophy. Duchamp has spent decades dismantling the traditional definition of art, first by selecting everyday objects as ready-mades, then by retreating into chess, then by creating a system of perception and participation that only manifests when someone engages with it. The idea is simple yet radical. The viewer is no longer a passive observer. The audience is a co-creator, and the meaning of the work is never fixed. Even among friends and peers, Duchamp's influence is quietly profound. Peggy Guggenheim credits him with helping shape her understanding of modern art. She writes about his uncanny ability to reveal hidden structures within any work or collection. Robert Motherwell recalls that Duchamp's advice about curatorial strategy altered the way he approached composition in his own paintings. Duchamp operates less like a teacher and more like a gentle, omnipresent force, nudging the art world's trajectory without ever demanding attention. Of course, scholars still debate his intentions. Was Duchamp deliberately retreating to highlight the absurdity of artistic fame? Was he testing the limits of audience perception? Or was his chess obsession merely a private joy, unrelated to art? Every interpretation feels plausible, and Duchamp himself rarely clarifies. That ambiguity is part of his lasting power. He remains a figure who cannot be fully pinned down. Amid these intellectual games, Duchamp's humor never fades. Friends recall dinners where he responds to serious debates about the future of art with deadpan remarks. Art is either plagiarism or revolution. Or, when asked whether he will paint again, I am not an artist. I am a breather. Even at social gatherings, his presence is mischievous. A reminder that the art world should never take itself too seriously. One particularly small yet revealing anecdote involves a young artist asking Duchamp whether Fountain was meant as a joke. Duchamp leans back, considers, and replies, "If it was funny, then it succeeded. If it wasn't, it succeeded anyway." That line encapsulates his philosophy. Results are secondary. The act of questioning, of provoking thought, is the art itself. Meanwhile, the chessboard waits. Duchamp continues to refine his strategies, occasionally lending his expertise to friends, occasionally competing in tournaments. He treats every match as both recreation and meditation. Like his ready-mades, chess is a medium that blends intellect, subtlety, and unpredictability. Through this lens, his life itself becomes a form of art. Every move, every retreat, every secret project a component in a larger, invisible composition. By the late 1950 seconds, Duchamp's reputation as an enigma is cemented. Younger artists cite him as a progenitor of conceptual art. Critics marvel at his foresight. Historians debate his legacy. And yet, Duchamp seems mostly unconcerned. He moves through the world with the same calm amusement, occasionally dropping aphorisms that will echo through decades of scholarship. The creative act is not performed by the artist alone. Art is a game between all people of all periods. The outcome doesn't matter. The moves do. Even in apparent silence, Duchamp remains profoundly active. His influence spreads quietly, invisibly, like a current beneath a river. Ideas ripple from one artist to another, from gallery to gallery, shaping the course of modern art without Duchamp ever needing to claim credit. In a sense, he has mastered the ultimate ready-made, the art of influence itself. By the 1960 seconds, Marcel Duchamp has become a living legend, a quiet lodestar in the shifting universe of modern art. His earlier provocations, Fountain, the ready-mades, Rose C'est la Vie, have all grown into myths, discussed in classrooms, journals, and cafes around the world. Yet Duchamp himself remains elusive, choosing to occupy the spaces between exhibitions rather than the exhibitions themselves. He has long abandoned the chase for fame or recognition, yet recognition finds him anyway. His influence is omnipresent, even when he is not. Duchamp continues to travel, spending time in Paris and New York, often moving between them with the calm precision of a man who knows the value of timing. Galleries and museums invite him to speak, to consult, to curate, but he does so selectively, on his own terms. His conversations, always subtly humorous, frequently challenge assumptions. One recalls a dinner in which a young art critic asks him, "Marcel, do you ever miss painting?" Duchamp leans back, exhales, and replies, "I never painted, I only arranged problems." It is during this period that Duchamp's philosophical approach to art reaches a new height. He becomes increasingly interested in the idea that art does not exist solely as an object but as an experience, a dynamic interaction between the creator, the object, and the viewer. He continues to expand on this notion in private sketches, notes, and letters, often cryptic, yet astonishingly prescient. In 1968, Duchamp participates in the exhibition The Writings of Marcel Duchamp in New York, which gathers essays, notes, and diagrams that document his thinking. For many, it's the first opportunity to glimpse the conceptual depth behind the playful provocations they had long admired from afar. His reflections show a mind that consistently challenges orthodoxy, questioning everything from aesthetic value to authorship, from the role of chance to the very definition of art itself. One lesser-known anecdote illustrates Duchamp's ongoing fascination with play and intellectual curiosity. During a visit to a museum, he takes a small group of students to a display of Renaissance paintings. Without touching anything, he asks them to imagine the subtle geometries and unseen motions in each composition, challenging them to read the brushstrokes like a chessboard. To Duchamp, every canvas is a series of moves. Every object a position in a mental game, an attitude that bridges his lifelong passions for art and chess. By now, the post-war generation of artists, the pop artists, minimalists, and conceptualists begin to fully understand the scale of Duchamp's influence. Andy Warhol, Claes Oldenburg, Joseph Kosuth, and Yoko Ono all cite his work as foundational. They see in Duchamp the freedom to question, to subvert, to redefine materials, context, and authorship. His early ready-mades now resonate in sculpture, performance, and installation art. His emphasis on the viewer's role echoes in interactive works and participatory pieces. His humor and irony live on in the playful absurdities of pop. Yet Duchamp is not merely an inspiration, he is also an enigma. Scholars debate endlessly whether he intended for his influence to spread in this way. Did he anticipate the impact of the ready-mades on conceptual art, or was his act of rebellion simply personal amusement? Did he see Rose Celavy as a joke, a statement, or both? Some historians argue that Duchamp's genius lies precisely in the ambiguity, the space left between action and interpretation. Others claim that his work is inherently incomplete, existing only as it is experienced. The debate, naturally, continues to this day. During these years, Duchamp also revisits the theme of replication. He authorizes further editions of his ready-mades and photographs, including meticulous reproductions of Fountain and the Bottle Rack. These acts are not commercial but philosophical. They challenge the notion of authenticity, asking whether originality resides in the object or the concept. Every replica is a meditation on perception, and every viewer becomes part of that meditation. As Duchamp grows older, he increasingly embraces a minimalist lifestyle. He spends hours at his chessboard, engaging in lengthy correspondence with friends and quietly refining ideas for his hidden masterpiece, the final work that he has been constructing for decades. It remains private, secretive, almost mythical, a culmination of a life spent challenging expectations. Even when not visible to the public, Duchamp's artistic mind continues to operate with precision and foresight. There's a small but telling anecdote from this period that exemplifies Duchamp's approach. When asked by an interviewer whether he believes art has a purpose, he responds, "Purpose is a heavy word. Art is a question. If it answers itself, it ceases to be art." His calm, ironic tone conveys both wisdom and mischief, and those who encounter it often leave feeling simultaneously enlightened and puzzled. As the 1970 seconds approach, Duchamp begins to slow down physically, but his intellectual presence never wavers. He remains engaged in correspondence with artists, curators, and collectors around the world, offering guidance, critiques, and encouragement. He quietly watches as conceptual art flourishes, as performance and installation pieces gain prominence, and as his own ideas echo in unexpected corners. One of the most remarkable aspects of Duchamp's later years is his embrace of indirect influence. He rarely exhibits, he rarely intervenes publicly. Instead, he nurtures ideas, allowing them to propagate organically. He teaches by example, demonstrating that an artist's legacy is not measured solely by output, but by the questions they leave behind, the frameworks they create, and the minds they inspire. In 1968, Duchamp participates in a retrospective at the Pasadena Art Museum. Critics and fans flock to see him, but he remains understated, gently correcting misconceptions and gently reminding audiences of the playful absurdities that underpin his work. He smiles faintly at the irony of it all. The same man who once scandalized the art world is now celebrated as a visionary. By the time Marcel Duchamp passes away in 1968, his impact is undeniable. He has reshaped the boundaries of art, introduced conceptual frameworks that continue to guide contemporary practice, and expanded the possibilities of creativity itself. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement is the enduring sense of freedom he leaves behind, the idea that art can exist as a thought, a gesture, or a question, and that the audience, too, is an essential participant in its creation. Even in death, Duchamp's legacy is a living conversation, an ongoing game of perception, wit, and intellect. His work challenges, provokes, and inspires. His ideas ripple outward, influencing generations of artists, designers, and thinkers who continue to reinterpret, question, and expand upon his vision. And so, as we step back from his life and reflect, it becomes clear that Duchamp's genius lies not merely in individual objects or moments, but in the overarching philosophy he embodied, a refusal to be confined, a mastery of ambiguity, and the relentless pursuit of freedom through thought, play, and perception. Now, let's slow down a little. Imagine the soft hum of a fan, the quiet rustle of a page turning, the gentle click of chess pieces moving across a board. Marcel Duchamp has walked through this world with calm amusement, his presence subtle yet profound, his ideas stretching like invisible threads connecting every corner of modern art. He has shown us that creativity can be a question rather than an answer, that influence can be quiet and profound, and that humor and thoughtfulness are not mutually exclusive. You can almost feel him smiling at the curiosity in your mind, the way he smiled at friends decades ago. And now, as the night deepens, let your thoughts drift slowly, gently, into the realm of dreams, carrying with them the echoes of ideas, games, and playful provocations. Sleep well, knowing that even in silence, imagination is alive.